Social Change podcast, where we speak with experts, leaders, and change makers about movements of social change that have transformed the landscape of Canada and the way we live our lives. We're in the Montreal office of the Chantier de l'économie sociale, speaking with CEO Nancy Neamtan.
The social economy is a term that's much more widely used in Europe than it has been in Canada or even in Quebec. But the fact of the matter is that when I was sort of foisted on me as a term, you do a little bit of research, and I found out that Alphonse Desjardins, who was the founder of the Desjardins movement, was member of the Montreal Society for the Social Economy in 1900 when he created the first credit union here, and was linked up to European networks of the social economy. And again, the social economy that was mainly the form of the cooperative movement, but it includes mutuals, includes associations, and if you go into Europe, when they talk about social economy, that's it. It's all the big mutuals, all the big associations, and so on. But it came at the beginning of capitalism, and there was two major social movements that came out of that. One was the labor movement, to protect workers from capitalist exploitation within the workplace, and the other was the cooperative movement to actually control in a more democratic, and egalitarian way the means of production and to control the workplace so. That at the beginning, the cooperative movement was a social movement. Now and over the years, it obviously became an important tool for in the 30s, for example, in Quebec, and I think across Canada, in the Great Depression. If it hadn't been for cooperatives, we would probably have no more agriculture in Canada. And we've seen historically how co-ops have responded to those needs. I mean, creation of Desjardins at the time was. Local, in a local rural community, people wanted access to credit. It was, local, professionals and farmers and so on. And the banks came down and said there's no market for it, there's no interest. So, they created a co-op. But and there were strong links with social movements for many years. But a certain, and then that debate is an international debate where for example, in certain continents, if you go to Latin America or you go to Europe, the emerging social economy, the emerging cooperative nonprofit, those kinds of socially oriented enterprises call themselves a solidarity economy because they feel that the old social economy has really become more, just part of the existing development model, and and that is a question, and a debate with the cooperative, the traditional, what we call the cooperative establishment, is. In the current context, and in the 21st century, is the creation of a cooperative a good thing in and of itself? And you take what went on, for example, and it's still going on in Great Britain. You have the Conservative government that comes in and says, we're going to cut down social services, public services, but it's okay. We're going to encourage our civil servants to create co-ops. Right. So if you take it from the perspective of saying, oh, more co-ops, that's great, then it's a good news story. It's it's progress. But from our perspective, it's not progress because you're cutting back in public services. So the issue of what is the cooperative an in and of itself, or is it a tool for economic democracy, for in a more inclusive economy, for call it what you want. Right. And that's where there's been really a parting of the ways, even internationally between. If you go to the International Cooperative Alliance, I mean, their big goal in 2000, was it 12 was the annual International Year of Cooperatives, was to be around the table with the biggest multinationals. When the G20 meets, then you have the B20 or the B40, and their complaint was there was no cooperatives, and now there is a cooperative, so this is good news for them. And well, from our perspective, that's not exactly, and in fact, and it's true in Quebec as it has been true in many countries across the world, the growth of what we call the social economy movement, if we want to be international, the social solidarity economy movement, has often met with huge resistance from the old cooperative establishment because it questions them on what happened along the way. What happened to that vision of contributing to another type of development model. And in the Chantier, when we were created, at the beginning, our mission for a long time was to promote the social economy as an integral part of the socioeconomic infrastructure of Quebec, to gain recognition and to support its development. And a few years ago, after going through a whole strategic, process, we said, no, we have to make that even clearer what we're doing. And so we changed our mission to say our mission is to promote the social economy and support its development as a component of a new development model. Which is more sustainable, more inclusive, obviously, environmental issues and so on. If we're to be more coherent, and we talk about a plural economy, saying that the social economy has a very important role to play, but we have to defend our public services, and we have to, give a better and a more progressive framework to the environment, which in the private sector is developing, while recognizing that private interests can continue to develop, as opposed to a vision that you could say, well, we want cooperatives to imitate what the private sector is doing. We have that discussion right now with Desjardins, who is very strongly criticized presently in regions and by people who were founding members of credit unions years ago, because they're closing down in rural areas and they're just following, and their rationale is to say, well, the banks are doing it and we have to keep up with the banks. And people are saying, but that's not what we created our local credit unions for. So it's an ongoing debate, and one of the ways that we try and deal with this at the Chantier, and having made that historical analysis right from the beginning, is by integrating social movements into our structure. So we have around the table, people from the labor movement, the youth movement, community movement, and so on, that will challenge us, on certain things by saying, wait, is that's a good idea because there's going to be more social economy enterprises in such a sector if it means it's being done to the detriment of working conditions, of environmental concerns, of defending public services, so you can't, it's not, you're part of of a system, you're part of a development model, and so what is your contribution? And that's like the basis for, because the social economy, like the cooperative movement, can be just a network of enterprises. Or is it a movement?
Well, that's what I was going to actually ask you. So
that's what I see. I think that in certain cases, when one talks about the cooperative movement, the word movement doesn't mean anything anymore, because for me, a movement is a movement, that has a long-term vision of certain transformation, that has, a multiplicity of dynamics, of opinions, that has room for debate and discussion, that is really supported and moved forward by the people that make up the movement, and not by the structure, and not by the the definition of the institution. And unfortunately, in what is called the cooperative movement, in many places, you've lost a lot of that, a lot of it. Some people say, and I think they're right, that it's not irreversible. One can come back maybe to that. That is possible in some cases. In other cases, perhaps it's too late. But, this debate has been going on. I was at a conference in Bologna when was it? It must have been about 10 years ago at least, if not more. And there was this fabulous debate just about, the what was it, on the, cooperative and entrepreneurship in Europe. And they had this debate on the relationship between cooperatives and social movements. And you had this fabulous debate where you had the head of a big German financial cooperative who said, we have nothing to do with social movements. We are a successful economic, business. That's what we are. And then you had this old Italian professor who was saying, it's the euthanasia. It's what's euthanasia? Euthanasia? That's the euthanasia of the cooperative movement. There's no future, And the fact of the matter is, if you look at what's going on in Quebec, where are the new cooperatives coming from? They're not coming from the old, cooperative structure. They're coming from mobilization in local communities where people want to save their village, they're responding to needs, very much linked up to social movements, linked up to all those kinds of things. And the old cooperative structures, on the contrary, are more, compressing based on the private sector models. So, you have a debate. So in that sense, maybe it's a movement, because within cooperatives there's all kinds of people, but shall we say, the progressive elements of the cooperative movement are very much present in the social economy movement, and they don't see that as a contradiction.
And just to take a step back now, so if some people are wondering, what is social economy as a definition of social economy, what does it actually encompass? We talked about, you mentioned cooperatives, obviously a big part of it, but there's so many different elements
That's,
like social enterprises and this. And so how would you define that?
Well, it has to be defined at different levels. Social economy at the sort of basic level are organizations, enterprises that are producing goods and services within the economy and that have a particular characteristic of being collectively owned, of being, therefore democratic, have a certain form of democracy in their functioning, where the primacy of people over capital, which is the fundamental difference between a private sector enterprise, but are also autonomous from government, which is different from a public, entity like here, Hydro-Quebec, or something. So every place has their definition that varies a little bit. In Quebec, we've sort of incarnated in it being collectively owned, democratic. That its goal is a return to the community as opposed to outside shareholders. That is independent of government, and we've added actually into those criteria primacy of people over capital, what we call based on the on individual and collective empowerment, I would say. So and responsibility, that everybody has an individual responsibility, but it's a collective form of organization. So that's the first level. These are these enterprises. So you can identify, you can say, well, they're part of, they're 8 or 9 or 10% of the economy. They're credit unions, they're mutuals, they're nonprofit organizations producing goods and services. But for us, the social economy is also is bigger in the sense of it's linked to a model of development, to a philosophy. So it's also a movement, in the sense that it comes into the economy not just as saying the goal is not necessarily to have a bigger part of the economy for having a bigger part of the economy. It's to respond to needs and aspirations of communities, but it's also to be part of a transformation of how our model of development is functioning today.
Okay. And it seems to me that the model of the social economy, the movement of social economy, if we can call it that, in Quebec has a very unique and distinct flavor to it. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, it has a very distinct flavor in the sense that it really came out, it was a movement that was built from the bottom up that didn't even call itself the social economy movement at the beginning because we didn't have that vocabulary, and but that came out of social movements, be it the community. I come out of the community movement. I was a community organizer, and and realized in the early 80s, coming out of another economic crisis, because they come back so regularly, and realizing that if we're trying to respond to social needs, but the problem was that we had an economic development model that was creating more and more exclusion and marginalization, and at the time, this is one of the rare advantages of getting old, is that at the time, that was when we were at the beginning of Reaganomics and Thatcherism. It was like in the early 80s, and what was the dominant theory was the trickle-down effect. And that's the whole theoretical basis for neoliberalism, is that what you do is you take away all the obstacles for the private sector to create wealth, and that wealth would then trickle down, and that's the way. So therefore, less government, less taxes, and so on, less trade barriers. Let them create wealth, and the wealth will trickle down. Now, there were two problems with that one. The first was that even the notion right from the beginning, and now I'm quoting Margaret Atwood. I didn't make it, but because I had never thought of it when I saw that she does this in this lecture she gave. She said, notice the vocabulary. It was not flow down effect. It's the trickle down effect. So even in the best of times, it was little droplets that were coming down. So even then, even in terms of the sharing wealth, it had its limits, but it was still this pretension that it would happen. The fact of that, so that's the first problem. The second problem is it didn't work. It didn't work. It didn't work because, and now the IMF is saying it clearly. They're saying this trickle-down effect does not work. The OECD has been saying that for 3 years now. They came out with 2 different studies. There has never been so much wealth creation in the world as there is today, and the gap between the rich and the poor, be it within countries like Canada, internationally, even with one region and the other within within Quebec, there has never been a bigger gap between the rich and the poor, despite the biggest creation of wealth creation. So the trickle-down effect has not worked. Right. It clearly has not worked. And so now that the vocabulary is more inclusive growth and inclusive prosperity. So we're changing the vocabulary, and and saying all kinds of things that that were not said before. Even though unfortunately our economic policy is still based on the trickle down effect. you're still, if you talk to the, the Harper government, if you talk to the Quebec government today, that's all they're, talk about is we have to create wealth. Well, yeah, we have to create wealth before you can share it. Whereas we see the social economy being a way of sharing wealth in the very process of creating it. So anyway, so just to go back to the social, what was it, to the origins. So in Quebec, it came out of, in fact, this movement, as I was saying, within the community movement, and it was a big debate at the time, and it was not.
What year are we looking at now?
We're talking about 83, 84.
Okay.
Those years was to say that the community movement, that we had to get involved in economic development. We had to do economic development to respond to the needs of the marginalized and so on, because otherwise, if we just let the trickle-down effect, nothing was trickling down. I mean, I was working 10 minutes away from downtown. They said trickle-down effect. I said, oh, really? What's trickling down? Zero. Nothing was trickling down. And we were 10 minutes away from downtown. Imagine if you were living in a rural region or you're living in Africa. I mean, so we were right, they were wrong, but of course we were very marginal at the time. But it was, and even within the community movement, there was a debate on this one too, because a lot of people didn't see, there was this whole mystification of the economy. The economy is something that, if you get involved in the economy, you get your hands dirty, you make compromises. So it came out of the community movement, and at the same time, you also had within the labor movement, and this is very particular to Quebec, the same kind of debate, and that's when they created in 1983. At the same time, we were starting in Pointe Saint Charles in Montreal. They were starting the Quebec Solidarity Fund, and the premise from that is the role of labor unions simply to negotiate better collective agreements, or should it become an actor in job creation and within the economy? And I mean, that was one motivation. The other was the fact that workers were not putting aside money for their retirement, so it was a way of encouraging them. So they negotiated this fiscal measure, to do it. And once again, it was a debate within the labor union. Not everybody thought it was a good idea. Like me, I was treated, it was a bit later, as a cheerleader for neoliberalism because we were talking about getting involved in economic development. But all this to say that what is specific to the Quebec model, shall we speak of the social economy, is that it really grew from the mobilization from the mobilization of social movements at a local level, at a labor union level, or for example, when the Chantier was created, it was like with the environmental movement. Well, in the the environmentalists were the first ones to start saying, well, we have to do more recycling, more reutilization of and so on, and it created so that they pushed to have certain obligations from government, different policies and so on, which created the environment for the creation of an environmental industry.
Right.
And then the question was, okay, so we just hand that over to the multinationals, hand that over to the private sector, and all the profits they'll make, they'll put it in their individual, or should we become involved in actually creating the enterprises within the environmental, industry to be able to use the profits and improve the environment. So, I mean, then you had a whole network of what we call sociale, of nonprofit recycling businesses that grew out of that, and so on. So there was all kinds of approaches to using an entrepreneurial approach, using the economy to achieve social goals, to achieve environmental goals, culture, and so on. So I would say that was perhaps one of the specificities of the Quebec model, was really that this movement has always been supported from the major social movements, and that beyond that, now it has become a movement in and of itself, I would say. But that wasn't the case at the time. Yeah, and that's why our structure was also. And the other thing was our vision of the social economy, compared to sometimes what we hear about social enterprises, that it was very much based on territory, on community. That we often talk about the social economy enterprises as being born out of a response to needs or aspirations of communities. It's it's locally based. It's collectively owned, and it's entrenched therefore in these dynamics of rural revitalization, of neighborhood development, and so on. And so once again, our for example our board of directors and our members is very original in the sense we have networks of enterprises around the table, but we also have networks of organizations working on local development. We have regional poles. We have social movements. The Assembly of First Nations has become asked and has become a member of our board. researchers. So it's like kind of an ecosystem that brings in people from all kinds of perspectives, because again, we see the social economy enterprise, be it a co-op, a nonprofit, as a tool and not an end of itself, and that our final end is to have an economy that's more democratic, inclusive, and sustainable.
And how close are you getting to that end goal?
Well, I mean, I would say, I was just reading, I don't know if you saw the Naomi Klein's, I was reading it last night, because she's been invited by the Pope. What's a nice Jewish girl like doing in a place like that? That's what my parents used to say about me. But, about, that the environmental imperative and urgency and almost catastrophe, it requires a new economy, a new economic paradigm. And so we're in this contradiction where I would say that we've done a lot of the groundwork, to get the knowledge and get the confidence and get the understanding of way things work to be able to scale up. But now the challenge for us is scaling it up, and that's when you start to have serious systemic change. And then obviously there's a political environment, which is not, but it's almost like a chicken and egg kind of thing, because I think that the political environment is very much contaminated by the idea that people have been really brainwashed into thinking there is no other way of running. That there's the economies, and this is what I thought in '83 when we started. I mean, we wanted to get involved in the economy, but I really thought it was like a mathematical science. We hired this guy who just came out of University of Montreal, master's degree, and said, look, we have this really poor neighborhood and we want to do economic development to get rid of poverty. And, so he just been learning all these traditional economics, and he came, I'll never forget, and he came back to us and he said, well, I found a way to get rid of poverty in Point St. Charles. And basically, we had all these old factories. He said, you change them into condos, and the poor won't be able to pay the rent anymore because there'll be a gentrification, so they'll leave. So you'll have gotten rid of poverty in Point St. Charles. That was his answer.
That's the solution. Huh?
Yeah, so we fired him, obviously, and wrote our own strategy that we worked with for many years. But what was I saying? So I would say that we're not there anymore. But in terms of general population, there still is this idea. Look what's going on in Greece. It's like. No, you need more austerity, but austerity, I'm not saying that, that they have a solution, the Greek government either, but all I'm saying is that, they're saying, oh, it's going to be terrible, Well, austerity has been terrible. It's been, I don't know if you read Stiglitz's thing, so our challenge, I think, and that's why we've changed our mission and we're working at that level, is changing scales to have a more important impact, in the economy, to demonstrate that we can develop our economy in a different way. And that means, better access to capital and so on. But we've done a lot of the groundwork, and in the sense that we now know how to use investment money. We've learned how to do. We've been able to show that we're doing enough investing to be able to say, look, it's not true this is high risk. This is low risk. Our people, they now the bankers say, your people pay back. Yeah, well, our people pay back because these are real enterprises that are responding to needs and aspirations of communities. So before they let these things go under, they're not going to just declare bankruptcy and cross across the street and open under a new name. These are important for people, but we have also learned how to analyze these enterprises to understand. If the community's not supporting it, the risk is too high. But if you got community support, even if you don't have a fancy business plan, it's probably a good idea, and we'll accompany. So, I mean, there's things we've learned. We certainly don't have access to all the same tools as traditional private companies do, but we've been pushing on this. We've been saying level playing field. Give us the same kind of tools, but adapted to our reality. The impact of these kinds of enterprises and the need for them in a context of inclusive development. So obviously we have not transformed the Quebec economy or the international economy, but somehow or other we're certainly part of the debate. That's why I thought the Naomi Klein thing was interesting, because she makes those things clearly. We don't have a new economic paradigm. We're never going to solve the environmental crisis, and that's the one that's really urgent, because unfortunately the social crisis and hunger and so on, well, humans keep reproducing, but nobody's going to reproduce the planet, so if we don't find a way to do something, then that's it. So I would say that I don't know when exactly, will it be in my lifetime or not, but it's got to be quicker than sooner than later, that the whole economic paradigm has to shift. I'm not saying we're going into communism, or we're going into another model, a development model, and that development model, that's what we're working on now. I mean, that becomes our big priority, and I think that's where the part movement really becomes something. There's going to be something that's clear, and we won't work on this alone. Obviously, we're working on it with all kinds of we're working with our First Nations. It's also a very inclusive kind of movement, the social economy, because we're not, we're not in competition with anybody. We're just saying, and we see that, we see, for example, public sector unions, when we started 20 years ago, most of them, and I'm not saying they're all at this point, but, we're very worried about the social economy being used as a way to privatize public services. And they were right to be, worried about that. And that's one of the reasons we wanted them around the table at all times, to be able to be following that really carefully and discussing, and seeing where we, and making the right choices, But now you have, like, for example, the nurses union that comes to us and say, look, we are tired of just saying that the way that our health system is badly organized, and seeing how it's all going to the private sector. And we need, and the social economy is for us a tool to move forward, to develop new models that are not based on a for-profit motive, but that are more flexible, etc. And it's a rampart against privatization. So, it's sort of, I laughed, and again, the reason, certain advantages of getting old is that, 20 years ago you were the Trojan horse of privatization, and now you're the rampart against it, So it's interesting how things evolve. But once that's said and done, there's so the issue of scaling up, there's and that's where the issue of access to capital becomes really important. But even then, you see an evolution internationally. I think there's a lot more talk than there is action at this point around what they call impact investment and so on. I know people in Toronto, they're really into it, but the Royal Bank is really into it. We call it social finance, and
yes.
we make a distinction. But
what is the distinction?
Well, impact investment is you invest in anything as long as it has social, environmental, supposedly returns. Whereas for us, social finance is really investing in long-term, collectively owned things that are really going to serve the common good in the long term. Because the problem with the individual entrepreneur, is it's great if they're doing, good things with their business. But what's the long term? What happens? You've seen it. Body Shop, it happened. Ben and Jerry's, it happened. The individual does it, and then they leave. It's gone, and and somebody else comes in, and it's over, right? And it's interesting to see also how to the extent to which the social and solidarity economy movement grows, the pressure on social finance to cross over this idea of collective of who's the owner is really. Is really stronger and stronger, which means I think that we're making progress.
That's good. Okay.
And at the same time, for example, you have scientists. I don't know if like was it the first, probably the only woman has won the Nobel Prize on the economy. Was this woman Eleanor Ostrom about 4 or 5 years ago, and what she studied, and she won a Nobel Prize. She crunched the numbers. I mean, she did the job, all the stuff, and what she showed is that the best way to develop or exploit, if you want to use that word, natural resources, is not through the private sector, because we know the short term, you want to make money and to hell with the planet, or the public sector, because it's very bureaucratic, top down, and not necessarily sensitive to even long term and so on. It's through collectively owned, citizen involved, democratically run organizations. She doesn't call it social economy. That's what she's saying. There's a whole movement. So if you look at it from the resource perspective, how we should be managing our resources, social economy is clearly the way we should be going. In cities, there's a big issue around cities is coming back to what they call the commons. The commons is neither private nor public. It's collective. It's informally collective. But when you formalize it, I was just at a conference in on this issue in New York, and there were people from Chicago and Detroit and Montreal and Toronto and so on, and everybody was talking about the commons. But then when they started talking about how to develop the commons, they went into this binary vision once again. Here we are, the private or the public. And I said, well, wait a minute. there's a third way, and that is consistent and coherent with what we're talking about when we're talking about the commons. So that's what we should be talking about, and that's why we should be working.
What's their response to?
Whoa! Oh, right. We never thought about it like that. Yeah. Okay. No. I mean, it's not finished, that one.
Oh, I'm sure it's not finished.
And in fact, often it is. Sometimes, they just don't call it. They don't have the vocabulary to call it that. Because that's what would be the other issues is the whole issue of making this visible. It is. In most economies, 8 to 10% of, which is, because when you consider the public sector is about half the economy when you put it all together, I mean, it's not that bad, but it could be bigger. And there's studies that show, for example, in certain consumer markets, if you have, if you have a consumer co-op, even if it only has 10% of the market, it has an impact because you show that you can sell cheaper, that you can, and there's tons of examples of that. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons, our experience here, for example, has been the old cooperative establishment. They go bonkers every time we create a new financial tool that is responding to community needs or doing patient capital and so on. And why are they doing that? Because we're showing that they could be doing better, and they're not. And they don't like that at all, because it's not the size of what we're doing. It's nothing compared to, these huge co-ops, financial co-ops. And I make an exception for some of them because the Van City is much more on our page, and there's several that are, but those who aren't, who've really, we have Desjardins being run by a former banker who just walked in and said, okay, I'm going to teach you guys how to become a real bank, so, that now she's having problems in terms of public image, but once that's said and done, just the idea of saying, well, it can be done differently. You can manage money differently. You can. So you have this whole move on that, and I can't remember what the first question was because I'm going on and on.
It's okay, it's all good. Okay. I wanted to actually ask you about what would you say after all, can we give the foundation for the social economy and its challenges and where it's at today? What, in your opinion, is the one or two of its greatest achievements that you're really proud of in terms of the social economy, what it has established, whether in Quebec or I'm looking at Quebec right now.
Yeah, well, I think what I'm really proud of is that it is a movement in the sense that it is perceived more and more, not by everybody, and particularly by young people, as a movement for transformation in which they can become proactive. They're not. That everything is to be done, and it's not all, it's not a done deal, and you come into the ranks or you don't, but a real movement in the sense of what I was saying before of being a multi-stakeholder, multi-sector, multi-ideas with places, and we see this, we, a lot of people in our demographic curve are worried about, where's the next generation. Here it's like, how quick can we oldies get out to leave more room for the, and I think that I'm really proud of that. So that this movement is just beginning; it's not ending. The other thing, what I would be proud of, that's a big thing. Is I guess we've been able to, put our money where our mouth is, in the sense we don't just talk, we do. We get things done, and we invest, as I say, the people are talking about impact investment, and, there's people and there's centers in Toronto that get millions to blah, 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 blah. But we're doing it, we're doing it. We're maybe too modest, but that's not, but again, that's how you get things done, not by just putting money into communications and blabbing, but actually doing things. And so, we that's the way we do things. We just do it. We just get it done. There's a need, and that's this is the whole pitch on social innovation. Everybody says, "Got to do social innovation." I keep saying that nobody wakes up in the morning saying, "I'm going to do social innovation." If they do, there's a problem. You wake up or you arrive somewhere and there's a problem, or there's a need, and nobody knows how to answer it. So you do something that's never been done because nobody's found the answer. Okay, well that's innovation, but you don't wake up and say, "I'm going to be an innovator." It drives me crazy. This, it's a whole spin on we're going to teach social innovation. No, what you have to do is teach people how to listen to what's going on, figure out what the problem is, and try and find solutions. Then you don't have to teach them what innovation is. They'll be innovating, and who cares what they call it. So, I think that's what we've done, is we've done a lot of innovation, in finance and all. But it's just because we say, okay, well, what has to be done, and then let's get it done, Yeah.
And the biggest challenges in your way, has it been political? Has it been...
Well, I think that one of the biggest challenges has been, yes, that the dominant ideology of the economy, the dominant perception of the economy is that it, is still, the trickle-down effect, and that neoliberalism is almost like the end of history, that there's no other ways to do things. And I think that's, and it's our challenge is to get the message out that that's not true, but that means also to make it concrete, to articulate what is that development model. When Naomi Klein says we need, she throws out, okay, but once we say that morally and and historically and even, more than, what's the word, philosophy, it won't exist if we don't do something different. Right. That has to be articulated, that has to be clarified, and that's a challenge of how do you do that, because it has, and I think that's a big challenge for us, is making that clear, getting it out there, and bringing more people into the fold to get the job done at a larger scale. That's really a big challenge for us, and a specific challenge within that, therefore, is leveraging the access to capital. There's so much money out there. It's our money, most of it. It's our pension funds, and it's our whatever, and most people would probably much prefer to have it going into things that are going to help them, but we have to be able to do the financial engineering and get the job done on that one, because that's one of the big obstacles for scaling up. And
just to take one other step back, just humor me here, about you personally, what got you into this whole, where you're sitting right now in the social economy? What as a young individual getting, thinking about where her career is going to take, or is this where you thought you were going to be? What sort of drove
Well,
you?
first of all, I never had a career plan. Never. I'm a 68er. You don't have a career plan. My career plan was to make the proletarian revolution or change the world or whatever. That was my career plan, was to change the world. So, so that was, I never had a clear plan. I have a BA in English literature, if you really want to know, and where I come from, and theater, and I played the fiddle, and I, whatever, and then I was a community organizer, and that's when, as I say, at a certain point, you just sort of say, how long, we're never get the job done, because it's just getting worse, it's not getting better, there's more marginalization, there's more unemployment, it's not going to happen, So
you're working in community at the time, realizing that more needs to be done.
Yeah. And also, as I say, I was in the extreme left for a while, and where you had the solution, and it was, the international revolution and so on, and realizing that was not, it wasn't happening, or what had happened was not, it hasn't quite worked out as was planned, and therefore basically saying, well, look, maybe I'll just start doing locally something that will make sense. And starting to do, I did all kinds of things. I was a militant, right?
You were
a militant. Getting involved.
Is that from your family? Does that go back to?
No, it's more my generation. My mother, my father was a store owner, and my mother was a social worker. So I guess maybe it was in my genes. But I wasn't brought up in I was brought up in well, maybe, I don't know. My parents were not radicals, but they weren't reactionaries either, and anyhow, but I was always, ever since even in high school, I was sort of involved in, fighting the education system, and, I always did that, and I was always like that. So, I just sort of fell into it, and then it grew. I just started with created an organization in 1983-40, and then it moved on, and then moved on, and moved on, and so I never had any career plan. It just sort of all of this just happened. I guess I'm some people say now that, you're a social entrepreneur, again, it's I was in Australia, and somebody said, what our definition of a social entrepreneur is? It's the head of a nonprofit with an ego. New terms that come in, whereas basically it's just getting the job done. Very pragmatic approach. After having been very ideological and realizing that it was not, I just became very pragmatic, and somehow the two got mixed in along the way.
That's great. Thank you for joining us today on the History of Social Change podcast. I'm your host, Elisa Birnbaum, publisher and editor of Sea Change magazine, and producer of the History of Social Change project. Be sure to stay tuned as we discuss other social change movements that have transformed the landscape of Canada and the way we live our lives.